Not every genius creates what they truly desire. Sometimes, they are forced to create the very thing they despise. And the strange part is this: those very creations go on to become immortal. If art is freedom, why is it that some of the greatest masterpieces are born from what the artist never wished to make? Michelangelo was a genius, a man who could see the human form hidden within stone, a man who believed that art was not about creating, but about releasing. Yet he was something else as well. Stubborn, difficult to approach, and never one to take orders. And still, there came a day when someone far more powerful than he was gave a command, and Michelangelo had no choice but to do what he did not want: to paint across a vast ceiling in the most sacred place in Rome. Tonight, let everything slow down for a moment. Let this story drift gently. No need to remember, only to listen. And if you wish to continue with stories like this, you may stay here, or simply return whenever you need a quiet pause. Now, let us go back to Rome, to the moment when it all began. Chapter 1: Michelangelo and the Ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. A great masterpiece born from pain. A summer morning in Rome. Light slips through the high windows and falls across the cold stone floor of the Sistine Chapel. The space is vast and hushed, filled only with the damp scent of plaster and the fine dust of pigment drifting in the air. This is where the cardinals of the Catholic Church gather to choose a new pope, one of the most sacred rooms in the Vatican. High above, nearly 20 meters from the ground, a man stands on a wooden scaffold, his face tilted upward toward the ceiling. His neck bends back at an unnatural angle. His eyes are red from paint and lime dust. His clothes have stiffened, layered with dried color. Drops of paint fall onto his face. They descend slowly, like heavy raindrops from an artificial sky. That man is not a painter. He is a sculptor. His name is Michelangelo. In the years to come, he will create one of the most iconic images in human history. But on that morning, Michelangelo is not thinking about glory. He is thinking about the pain in his neck. Later, he will write about it in a poem to a friend. He describes his body as a bow pulled taut and bent beyond comfort. His stomach pressed against his chest, his chin fused to his throat, his back arched like a cat stretched too far. Paint runs into his eyes, blurring his sight until he can barely see. This is not the posture of a genius. It is the posture of someone enduring. And the strangest truth is that Michelangelo never wanted to paint this ceiling. He wanted to carve stone. From a young age, he believed that true art did not live in color or brushstrokes. It lived in marble. Within every rough block of stone, he saw a human figure waiting to be freed. The artist's task was not to create form. It was to remove what did not belong. And when the excess was gone, the figure would reveal itself. But in the year 1508, another man decided to change the course of Michelangelo's life. That man was Pope Julius II. At the dawn of the 16th century, Rome was entering an age of ambition. The Pope sought to transform the city into the artistic and political center of Europe, a new Rome that could stand beside the glory of the ancient empire. Grand projects rose across the city. The old St. Peter's Basilica was preparing to be rebuilt. Artists from across Italy were drawn to Rome like pilgrims. Julius II was not the kind of pope people imagine when they think of quiet devotion. He preferred war to prayer. He rode on horseback into battle and wore armor beneath his crimson robes. His contemporaries called him the warrior pope. Julius wanted Rome to become the greatest center of the Christian world. To do that, he needed art. And for art, he needed Michelangelo. The two men could not have been more different. Michelangelo lived almost like a recluse. He slept in his clothes, ate little, and rarely bathed. He disliked society, avoided idle conversation, and above all, resented being told what to do. Julius II was the opposite. He was accustomed to command, accustomed to victory. And when he wanted something, all of Rome was expected to obey. At first, Julius commissioned Michelangelo to build a monumental tomb. It was meant to be vast, adorned with dozens of marble statues. Michelangelo embraced the project with a rare excitement, traveling to the quarries of Carrara to select each block of stone with his own hands. And then, without warning, everything stopped. The Pope changed his mind. Instead of a tomb, Julius wanted Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. To Michelangelo, it felt almost like an insult. He was not a painter. He was a sculptor. Painting frescoes across such an immense ceiling was not only difficult, it was nearly impossible. The plaster had to be laid while still wet. The pigments had to be applied before the plaster dried. A single mistake meant scraping everything away and starting again from nothing. Michelangelo believed his rivals had persuaded the Pope to give him this task. They hoped he would fail. So he did the only thing he could think of. He fled Rome. For a brief time, he left the city with anger still burning in him. But escaping a pope was never simple. Julius sent letters, then envoys, and finally, threats. Michelangelo returned, and he began to paint. The early days were disastrous. The first layer of plaster failed, causing the colors to bloom and blur, forcing him to scrape it all away. The assistants he hired did not meet his standards. One by one, he dismissed them until he chose to paint most of the ceiling alone. Day after day, he climbed the scaffold, not to carve stone, as he had always wished, but to paint a sky. And then, something strange began to happen. The figures that emerged across the ceiling did not resemble ordinary paintings. They were not soft like the works of Florence. They were powerful, weighty as if carved from stone. Massive bodies twisted through space. Prophets sat in deep contemplation, like living statues. And at the center of it all, a small yet overwhelming scene. Two hands reaching toward each other. One belongs to God, the other to Adam. Between them, only the smallest space remains. That space has endured for more than 500 years. And still, millions stand beneath the Sistine ceiling, looking up at that suspended moment. When the work was completed in the year 1512, Rome fell into a kind of silence. No one had ever seen anything like it. Young artists from Rome and Florence came to witness the new ceiling. Raphael, who was working in the Vatican at the time, is said to have changed his own style after seeing the monumental figures Michelangelo had brought to life. But Michelangelo did not celebrate. He stepped down from the scaffold, left the chapel behind, and returned to his marble. To the world, he had created a masterpiece. To Michelangelo, it was only a chapter in a life shaped by conflict. because he had never truly wanted to paint the sky. He only wanted to free the figures trapped within stone, and to understand why he believed that so deeply. We must return to Florence, to a boy who once believed that inside every block of stone, a soul was waiting to be released. Chapter 2. Michelangelo's childhood in Florence, the boy who believed. There were people hidden inside stone. Florence, in the late 15th century, was not a quiet city. Narrow stone streets echoed with the darb of hammers, the rumble of carts, and the voices of vendors calling out from early morning. The air carried the scent of tanned leather from the workshops, the warmth of freshly baked bread from nearby ovens, and sometimes the sharp, powdery trace of marble being carved apart. By modern standards, Florence was small, but in its time, it was one of the wealthiest and most vibrant places in Europe. The banking merchants of the Medici family had turned it into the financial heart of Italy. Money flowed into the city, and with it, art. Churches were adorned with new paintings, public squares filled with marble statues. Young artists arrived with quiet hope, searching for patrons. Centuries later, this era would be called the Renaissance. But for those living within it, this was simply their present. Art was not history. It was daily life. Florence felt like a vast workshop. Along its narrow streets, the doors of studios and sculpture yards stood open. Apprentices ground pigments from mineral stone, mixed them with egg and oil, or carved marble from morning until dusk. In one corner of the city, Leonardo da Vinci trained in the workshop of Verrocchio. Elsewhere, Botticelli painted for the Medici. Churches constantly commissioned new frescoes, and the city squares demanded new statues to display Florence's growing wealth. Florence was not just a place where art existed. It was a place where art competed. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti. Simone was born on March 6, 1475, in a small town called Caprese. His father was a minor official of Florence, a man who believed his family descended from a fading line of nobility. And so he held a clear vision for his son's future. He wanted Michelangelo to become a scholar, or an official, or at the very least, a man of respectable profession, but certainly not an artist. In Florence at that time, artists were not seen as geniuses. They were craftsmen. They worked in noisy studios, their hands covered in dust and pigment, no different from shoemakers or blacksmiths. Michelangelo's father believed his son was meant for something more refined. And so, whenever he saw the boy drawing, he did not see talent. He saw a life going astray. There were moments when Michelangelo hid his small sketches in the corners of his room, or slipped them between the pages of books so his father would not find them. Not out of fear of punishment, but because he knew he would be asked to explain something he could not yet put into words. These drawings were not a game. And yet, Michelangelo found himself drawn to the very places his father despised. When he was still a child, Michelangelo was sent to live with a family in the countryside near Florence. His wet nurse was the wife of a stonecutter. Around their modest home stretched quarries and marble workshops. Settignano, the hillside village where he grew up, was known across Tuscany for its stone. From those pale gray slopes, massive blocks were cut and hauled down to Florence by ox-drawn carts. There, they became church columns, and statues of saints or intricate details for palaces. To most children, it was simply the heavy labor of adults. But Michelangelo would stand and watch the workers for hours. Each strike of the hammer against the chisel rang sharp and dry in the air. From the rough stone, a curve would slowly emerge. A hand. A face. Years later, Michelangelo would joke that along with his nurse's milk, he had absorbed the hammer and chisel of the sculptor's trade. Perhaps it was not only a joke. From a very early age, he was captivated by stone, not by statues already finished, but by raw blocks, cold and heavy. To the boy, they were not lifeless. They felt like secrets. The stones lay in silence within the workshops, waiting for someone to see what others could not. Florence, at that time, was a city saturated with art. Across church walls, frescoes told stories from the Bible. In the squares, the sculptures of Donatello and other masters stood among the crowds like witnesses to their age. A child growing up among such images could hardly remain untouched. Michelangelo began to draw when he was very young. But he did not draw for the love of color. He drew to understand the human body. In small notebooks, he sketched hands, feet, faces. The lines were not yet perfect, but they carried a quiet intensity. Even then, he seemed already absorbed by the structure of the human form. Muscle, bone, the tension beneath the skin. To him, the human body was not just a shape. It was a kind of architecture. But his father could not see this. To him, Michelangelo was only a boy wasting time on meaningless drawings. Again and again, he tried to force his son toward proper studies. Latin, or grammar, mathematics, the disciplines expected of a young gentleman. Michelangelo learned, but without affection. Instead of staying with his books, he wandered through the streets of Florence. He would stand for hours inside workshops, watching painters and sculptors at work. He observed how they mixed pigments, how they carved stone, how a lifeless block slowly took on the form of a human being. Perhaps it was during those years that Michelangelo began to feel something he could not yet explain. When he looked at rough marble, he did not see only stone. He saw faint lines hidden within, as if a figure were trapped beneath the cold surface. Many years later, when he had become a renowned artist, Michelangelo would say that the sculptor does not truly create the statue. The statue already exists within the stone. His task is only to remove what is unnecessary, to set it free. It was a strange thought for a boy, but it would become the philosophy of his entire life. And yet, to become an artist in Florence, Michelangelo would have to do the one thing his father did not want. He would have to enter an apprentice workshop, a place loud with labor, fierce with competition, and at times edged with violence. And it was there that Michelangelo would learn his first lesson about the world of art. A lesson that began with a single blow. Chapter 3. The Harsh Years of Apprenticeship. A Broken Nose and the Ruthless World of Renaissance Art. That morning, in a room where young artists of Florence often gathered to draw and copy paintings, the air was thick with the scent of linseed oil, pigments ground from mineral stone, and the damp wood of painting panels. Light slanted through a high window, falling across sketches and half-finished works. Apprentices stood scattered around the room, each absorbed in their own drawing. In those days, Florence was a place where art was learned through watching and imitation. Young artists would go to churches to copy the works of earlier masters. It was both practice and proof of ability. In one corner of the room, two apprentices argued. One of them was Michelangelo, only 13, thin and with eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. The other was Pietro Torrigiano, a few years older, known among the young artists for his quick temper. At first, it was only words, a sharp exchange between two boys trying to prove themselves. Then Torrigiano raised his hand. The blow landed squarely on Michelangelo's face. It was strong enough to break the bridge of his nose. Blood fell onto the stone floor. And from that moment on, Michelangelo's nose would never be straight again. Years later, Torrigiano would recount the story with a trace of pride. He said his punch had flattened Michelangelo's nose like a piece of bread. It is one of those strange details history leaves behind. A single strike between two boys in Florence marked the face of one of the greatest artists the world would ever know. But to understand why they fought, we must look at the world they lived in. Florence, at that time, had no art schools in the modern sense. Artists did not learn in classrooms. They learned in workshops, where everything was both education and labor. These workshops were called bottega. A bottega was like a restless hive. Apprentices mixed pigments, prepared panels, stretched canvas, or copied the master's work. Those who stayed longer were gradually allowed to paint small sections of larger compositions. Only after many years did they earn the chance to create something of their own. The path to becoming an artist in the Renaissance was not quick. It was a long discipline, shaped over time. Michelangelo entered such a workshop at the age of 13. After many arguments within his family, his father finally accepted that his son would not become a scholar. Michelangelo was sent to apprentice under Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the most respected painters in Florence. It was not a complete victory. Michelangelo was allowed to do what he loved, but not in a way his father fully embraced. He was no longer forbidden to draw, yet he received no real encouragement. And in the years that followed, every step forward in Michelangelo's life would feel like something he had to prove on his own. Ghirlandaio was a master of fresco. His wall paintings adorned churches across the city, from quiet monasteries to grand cathedrals. His patrons were wealthy families and members of the clergy. His workshop was never still. Apprentices worked from early morning until nightfall. They learned to grind pigments from mineral stone, and to mix color with egg yolk, and to paint onto wet plaster before it dried. It was work that demanded both skill and discipline. But Michelangelo was not an ordinary apprentice. From the beginning, he stood apart. While others were content to copy the master's work, Michelangelo pushed further. He studied every detail of the human body. His drawings carried weight. Muscles were defined. Forms held structure. It was as if he was not simply drawing the body, but trying to understand how it was built. That difference unsettled the others. A boy who had just arrived, yet drew as though he understood the human form more deeply than they did. In a city as competitive as Florence, that alone was enough to create tension. Florence was a city of art, but it was also a city of rivalry. Workshops competed with one another. Artists competed with one another. Even apprentices were locked in quiet competition. In such a world, small arguments could easily turn into violence. Torrigiano's blow was likely only one of many conflicts within the workshop. But for Michelangelo, it left a mark that would follow him for the rest of his life. If you look at portraits of him in later years, you will see it. A nose slightly flattened, slightly askew, not a natural feature, but the trace of a single morning in a Florentine workshop. And yet, that blow did not weaken him. If anything, it hardened him. Michelangelo had already been a difficult man, reserved, quick to anger, unwilling to be guided. After the incident, those qualities only grew sharper. He worked more, drew more, and began to spend more time studying ancient sculpture. Florence, at that time, was awakening to the art of antiquity. Wealthy families, especially the Medici, collected statues from Greece and Rome as symbols of knowledge and power. In their gardens and palaces, these ancient figures stood among trees and fountains, open for young artists to study. They revealed the human body in a way that painting rarely could. Michelangelo was captivated. He did not simply look at the statues, he studied them. He traced every muscle, every movement of the form. To him, these ancient works were not relics of the past. They were lessons. And while Michelangelo was learning those lessons in Ghirlandaio's workshop, someone else in Florence began to notice him. That man was Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo was not only the wealthiest man in Florence, he was its most powerful patron of the arts. In the sculpture garden of the Medici Palace, an ancient statue stood among trees and flowing water. There, Lorenzo allowed gifted young artists to come and learn. And one day, Michelangelo would walk into that garden, and his life would change completely. Chapter 4. Michelangelo in the Medici Palace. When a young genius entered the center of power in Florence. In the garden behind the Medici Palace in Florence, ancient statues from Greece and Rome stood scattered along stone paths. Beneath the shade of orange and laurel trees, young artists gathered to draw these figures that had endured for centuries. To them, each statue was a lesson in the human body. One boy often arrived earlier than the others. He would stand before the sculptures for long stretches of time, studying the curve of muscle, the balance of the body. Sometimes he sketched them in charcoal. Sometimes he simply stood in silence, as if trying to read a secret hidden in stone. That boy was Michelangelo. Florence in the late 15th century was a city where art and power were deeply intertwined. Wealthy families competed through churches, statues, and grand paintings. Artists were no longer just craftsmen. They were part of how a city defined its legacy. And the most powerful family in Florence was the Medici. Under the guidance of Lorenzo de' Medici, the city became a center of art and learning. Lorenzo was not an artist himself, but he understood that art could bring a kind of glory that outlasted political power. He collected ancient sculptures and opened his garden to young artists, allowing them to study freely. One of the mentors in that garden was Bertoldo di Giovanni, a former student of Donatello. He encouraged the young artists to study ancient sculpture, to understand the human body, and how form moves through space. Michelangelo was drawn into this world almost immediately. He spent hours in the Medici garden, sketching stone bodies and trying to understand how they were made. To him, stone was not just material. It felt like a body waiting to be released. One day, Michelangelo began carving a small sculpture. It was the head of an old faun, a creature from Greek mythology, half man and half goat. He carved the face with deep wrinkles and a faint, playful smile. When he finished, the faun still had a full set of teeth, like a young man laughing. Not long after, Lorenzo de' Medici passed through the garden. He often walked there, observing the young artists at work. When he stopped before Michelangelo's sculpture, he studied the face of the faun. After a moment of silence, he smiled and made a simple remark. An old creature like this would not have all its teeth. Michelangelo did not argue. He picked up his chisel and struck the sculpture. And with a few quick movements, one of the faun's teeth disappeared. He carved the gum line to make the mouth appear older. The figure changed at once. It felt more alive. Lorenzo laughed. He saw not only skill in Michelangelo's work, but a sharpness of mind, a rare instinct for observation. And according to later accounts, it was in that moment that Lorenzo began to take a particular interest in the young artist. Not long after, Michelangelo was invited to live in the Medici palace. For a young man from a struggling noble family, it felt like stepping into an entirely different world. Inside the palace, he found himself surrounded by a circle of minds he had never imagined. Poets recited their verses in vast rooms, while scholars debated Greek philosophy and the newly translated works of Plato. Here, art was not merely a craft, and it was part of intellectual life. But Michelangelo did not belong to those conversations. He listened more than he spoke. While scholars exchanged ideas about language and philosophy, his attention seemed to drift elsewhere, toward how an idea could take form, how a body could carry meaning beyond itself. Among those who shaped the atmosphere of the Medici Palace was Marsilio Ficino, the philosopher who led the circle devoted to Plato. Ficino often spoke of how the beauty of the human body reflects the beauty of the soul. Ideas like these lingered in the air Michelangelo breathed. Though he was not a philosopher, the conversations within the palace slowly began to change how he saw the human form and the purpose of art itself. During these years in Florence, Michelangelo began to create some of his first sculptures. One of the earliest was Madonna of the Stairs. It was small, yet the folds of fabric and the weight of form already revealed the mind of a true sculptor. Another work, Battle of the Centaurs, was more daring. In that relief, bodies twist into one another in a violent struggle. Muscles tighten. Figures turn in multiple directions at once. For an artist not yet 20, it was a work filled with ambition. Bertoldo saw it clearly. Michelangelo was moving along the path of a great sculptor, and Lorenzo saw it as well. Under Medici patronage, Michelangelo was no longer just an apprentice in a workshop. He had become a young artist learning at the very center of Florence's intellectual world. But Florence was not a stable city. In 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died. His death shook the entire structure of power, and the influence of the Medici began to fade, and voices condemning the city's luxury grew louder. A Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola began to draw crowds with his fierce sermons. He spoke of a Florence that had grown too proud, a city in need of purification. For Michelangelo, The world he had just entered within the Medici palace was about to change completely. Chapter 5. The Fall of Renaissance. Florence, when religion and power reshaped Michelangelo's fate. When Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, Florence seemed to lose its center. For years, the Medici Palace had been a gathering place for scholars, poets, and artists, where conversations moved between philosophy, art, and the beauty of the ancient world. But after Lorenzo's death, those conversations began to fade into silence. A vacuum of power opened, and within that silence, another voice began to rise across the city. That voice belonged to Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola was a Dominican friar with a fierce voice and eyes that seemed to burn. In his sermons, he spoke of a Florence that had grown proud. He warned that its wealth, its lavish art, even the ancient statues the city admired, might be signs of moral decay. His words unsettled many, but they also drew belief. Savonarola did not speak like a scholar. He spoke like a prophet. He warned that if Florence did not change, it would face divine punishment. His sermons quickly filled the churches. In crowded spaces, he called for Florence to become a city of faith. Those who listened began to believe their city had been chosen for a higher purpose. For Michelangelo, this transformation did not happen all at once. It moved like a slow, cold wind through the streets. The conversations about Plato and classical beauty that once filled the Medici Palace were replaced by warnings of sin and calls for purification. He could not have ignored those sermons. Michelangelo was not easily carried away by religious fervor. But there was a force in Savonarola's voice that even skeptics could not dismiss. In a city where art had once stood as a symbol of glory, some now began to question the very statues and paintings they had once admired. Florence grew more severe. In the streets, processions formed. Voices rose in hymns, calling for a simpler life. Groups of young people moved through neighborhoods, collecting objects seen as vain. Mirrors, musical instruments, paintings, luxurious ornaments. It was the sign of a city in transition. But the greatest shift came in 1494. That year, King Charles VIII of France marched into the Italian peninsula. His armies moved quickly from city to city, leaving uncertainty in their wake. When news of the invasion reached Florence, the city fell into crisis. At that time, the head of the Medici family was Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's son. Unlike his father, Piero lacked political strength, and as Charles VIII approached Florence, he made decisions that angered many within the city. Before long, the Medici family was driven out of Florence. It was a shock that echoed through every corner of the city. For decades, the Medici had been the center of power in Florence. They supported artists, protected scholars, and created a world in which young talents like Michelangelo could grow. When the Medici were overthrown, that world collapsed with them. Savonarola quickly rose to become one of the most influential figures in this new Florence. He called for a city shaped by simplicity and moral discipline. Under his influence, Florence began to change with startling speed. For young artists, it was a bewildering time. Art had once been the pride of the city. Now, some began to see it as a sign of vanity. And the ancient statues that had been admired were now, in certain eyes, symbols of arrogance. Michelangelo watched it all. He did not join the rising religious movements, but he understood that the city he had grown up in was no longer the same. The patrons who once supported him were gone. The world of the Medici had vanished. And in that moment, Michelangelo made a decision. He left Florence. Around 1494, he departed for Bologna. It was the first time in his life he had lived away from Florence for any length of time. There, he worked for the church of San Domenico, carving small figures for a saint's tomb. They were not grand works, but they were the work of a young artist learning how to survive without the protection of powerful patrons. In Bologna, his life narrowed into something simple: work, payment, shelter, and work again. And there were no sculpture gardens, no meals in palaces, no sense that art might carry him into the center of an age. Only the hands of a young craftsman, and a quiet question: would talent alone be enough when no one stood behind him? Bologna gave him work, but not yet a destiny. And so Michelangelo began to think of a place larger, more ambitious, and far more unforgiving. A place where ancient statues still stood at the crossroads of power, faith, and wealth. That place was Rome. And when Michelangelo arrived there in 1496, he was not yet a celebrated genius. He was simply a young artist, nearly unknown, carrying with him the hands of a sculptor and the belief that stone could still become human. Chapter 6. Michelangelo arrives in Rome. The struggle for survival of an unknown young artist. In Rome at the end of the 15th century, an ancient Roman statue could be bought if one had enough money. Broken figures were unearthed from the ground and sold to cardinals and nobles. No one knew the names of the artists who had carved them centuries before. Michelangelo arrived in Rome with a quiet hope that one day his own sculptures might stand among them. Rome was not like Florence. Florence was a city of workshops where young artists could learn, copy, and slowly find patrons. Rome was something else entirely. It was a city of power, of popes and cardinals, of wealthy families determined to reshape this ancient place into the center of the Christian world. But Rome was also a city of ruins. Across its streets, broken columns, among ancient statues, and fragments of marble lay scattered among newly built churches and palaces. Artists who came to Rome often said it felt like a vast museum of the ancient world. Michelangelo entered that city with almost nothing. No reputation, no powerful patron, and very little money. The early years were far from glorious. He lived simply without stability. He took whatever work he could find, anything that might allow him to endure. For a young artist, Rome was not an easy place. It was filled with talent, each one seeking the attention of cardinals and noble patrons. Those in power did not care for potential. They cared for what could impress them now. And so Michelangelo did what many young artists must do. He searched for a way to prove himself. One of the first to offer him help was Jacopo Galli, a Roman noble and collector of art. Galli admired ancient sculpture and often befriended young artists. When Michelangelo arrived, Galli offered him a place to stay and introduced him to people who might commission work. But the first opportunities came in unexpected ways. There is a strange story from those early Roman years. An art dealer asked Michelangelo to carve a statue in the style of antiquity. When it was finished, the dealer buried it in the ground for a time, allowing the marble to age. Then he sold it as if it were an ancient Roman piece. The work became known as the Sleeping Cupid. When it was sold, some believed it to be truly ancient, but the truth eventually surfaced. And instead of damaging Michelangelo's name, the story did something else. It made people in Rome begin to notice him. If a young artist could create a sculpture that people mistook for an ancient work, it was no small thing. And yet, even after that story, Michelangelo was still not famous. He was still waiting for a true opportunity. Rome, at that time, was a city where power and art were inseparable. Cardinals and popes commissioned grand works to adorn their churches and palaces. For an artist, a single patron at the right moment could change everything. That moment came in 1497. A French cardinal, Jean de Belair de la Graulas, was seeking a sculpture for St. Peter's in Rome. He wanted an image of the Virgin Mary holding the body of Christ after the crucifixion. The subject had been depicted many times before. But Michelangelo saw something more within it. He wanted to create a sculpture that would not only tell a sacred story, but also reveal the beauty and the sorrow of the human body. He was only about 22 years old. He accepted the commission and began searching for the right block of marble. To Michelangelo, choosing the stone was almost as important as carving it. He believed the form already existed within, and that the artist's task was to set it free. The marble he chose came from Carrara, a place he had known since his earlier years with the Medici. It was white, smooth, and nearly without flaw, a stone that could become something enduring. Michelangelo began to work. The days in the workshop moved slowly. The sound of the chisel against the stone echoed in a steady rhythm. Marble dust drifted through the air, settling into his hair and clothing, and he worked almost entirely alone. He did not like others interfering with his work. Every detail had to pass through his hands. Every curve of the body, every fold of the drapery, was studied with care. Slowly, the form began to emerge. The Virgin Mary sat in stillness, her face calm yet filled with quiet sorrow. Across her lap lay the body of Christ, newly taken down from the cross. The body was soft, heavy, utterly lifeless. Michelangelo sought a contrast: the serenity of the mother and the stillness of death. And then he made a bold choice. Instead of carving Mary as an aged woman, he gave her a youthful face. To him, purity and grace were untouched by time. It was an idea that set the sculpture apart from many that had come before. In his small workshop, Michelangelo worked alone, surrounded by the steady rhythm of the chisel and the pale dust of marble suspended in the air. Line by line, the figure revealed itself beneath his hands, slowly and with certainty, as if it had always been waiting inside the stone. Outside, Rome continued in its restless motion, unaware of him. Chapter 7. The Pietà, the sculpture that made Rome. Recognize Michelangelo's genius. In a quiet corner of the old St. Peter's in Rome, a small group stood in silence before a newly placed sculpture. The dim light of candles brushed across the surface of white marble, making the body of Christ seem as though it might still breathe. For a few moments, no one spoke. They only looked. Before them sat the Virgin Mary, youthful and composed, holding the lifeless body of her Son across her lap. There were no tears, no gesture of despair, only a silence so deep it seemed to press against the chest. One man stepped closer. He leaned in. studying the hand of Christ. The fingers hung loose, emptied of life, yet still carried the softness of a living body. He reached out, then stopped just short of touching the stone, and as if afraid he might break something fragile. This was the Pietà. Michelangelo was only about 24. The sculpture had emerged from a block of Carrara marble he had chosen with care. But what set it apart was not the material. It was the way he shaped it. For months, Michelangelo had worked almost without pause in his workshop. The sound of a chisel striking stone echoed from early morning into the night. Marble dust clung to his skin and hair, settling into a pale layer that made him resemble the very figures he was creating. The body of Christ was soft, surrendered, as if life had only just left it. The muscles no longer held tension. They yielded to gravity. Even in stone, the weight of the body could be felt. And beside that weight, Mary remained utterly still. Her face bore no age. Michelangelo had carved her young, almost untouched by time. To him, purity was not something worn down by years. These two images formed a quiet contrast, death and something beyond it, sorrow and stillness. But what made the Pietà different was not only its precision, it was the way the stone seemed to live. The folds of the drapery fell like real fabric. The surface of the skin was polished so finely that light moved across it as if it were flesh. And within all those details, there was a feeling that the sculpture had not been made, but released. Michelangelo spent long hours on this final stage. With small tools, he refined the marble again and again, until light itself seemed to respond to it. For him, the work was not finished when the form appeared. It ended only when the stone began to receive light like a living surface. People began to speak of it. The story spread through Rome. Some could not believe that such a work had been created by a young artist. There were whispers that it must belong to an established master. Michelangelo heard those whispers. He was not a man who sought out conflict. But this time, he did something he almost never did. One night, Michelangelo returned to the church. In the dim light, he approached his sculpture and began to carve words into the ribbon that crossed the Virgin's chest. Letter by letter, they emerged beneath his chisel. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Fiorentino Fascibat. Michelangelo, the Florentine, made this. It would be the only time in his life that Michelangelo signed his work. The story spread quickly. And this time, there was no doubt. Rome began to know his name. For a young artist, recognition came suddenly and with force, and those who had once overlooked him now spoke of him in conversation. Cardinals and nobles began to take an interest in the man who had created the Pietà. And yet, Michelangelo's response was not what one might expect. He did not celebrate. He continued to live simply. He worked alone. He kept his distance from society. To him, the Pietà was not an ending. It was only a step. But Rome no longer saw him the same way. From an unknown artist, Michelangelo had become a name spoken of when sculpture was discussed. And in a city like Rome, that meant something very specific. Opportunity. Larger commissions, larger blocks of stone, greater expectations. For Michelangelo, it was both a reward and a weight. Because from that moment on, he no longer needed to prove that he had talent. He needed to prove that the Pietà had not been an accident. Fame had arrived quickly, but Michelangelo did not fully trust it. He understood that one work could astonish, and the next could be forgotten if it failed to carry the same strength. That knowledge drove him to work harder, and to withdraw even further. While Rome was beginning to recognize his name, another city was preparing to call him back. Florence, the city where he had first learned to see the human form within stone, a city that had passed through upheaval and now sought a new symbol for itself. Somewhere within it, a great block of marble, abandoned for years, was waiting for someone bold enough to transform it into something the entire city could claim as its own. And that someone would be Michelangelo. Chapter 8. Michelangelo returns to Florence. When the city entrusts him with a forgotten block of stone. In the courtyard of a church in Florence, a block of marble had stood for years. It was taller than a man. Its surface had been worn by rain and wind, veins of cracks running through it like something long dead. No one touched it anymore. People called it simply the ruined block. Years earlier, an artist had begun working on it and abandoned the effort. Others who came after refused to continue. The stone was too narrow, too tall, and already damaged in ways that made shaping it nearly impossible. To most, it was no longer material for a great work. It was an expensive mistake. In a city like Florence, where art was tied to honor, the block remained like a scar, visible to all, claimed by none. But when Michelangelo returned to Florence around the year 1500, the city was no longer the one he had left behind. The years under Savonarola had left their mark. A certain severity still lingered in the air. But something else was forming. Florence seemed to be searching for a new image of itself. Something that could stand in a public square and speak for the entire city. It was no longer the Florence of lavish gatherings and classical philosophy. But it had not fully become a city of austerity either. It stood somewhere in between, and it needed a symbol. In that moment, the forgotten block of marble was mentioned again. The city council wanted a great statue, something that could represent the strength and will of Florence. But when they looked at that block, the question was no longer what to carve. It was who would dare. In council discussions and among the workshops, a name began to surface. At first, cautiously, then with growing certainty. Michelangelo. He was no longer the boy from the Medici garden. The Pietà had given him a reputation strong enough to be considered for something greater. But that reputation came with risk. If he failed with this stone, everything could collapse just as quickly. Michelangelo came to see it. He stood before the block in silence. The surface was rough. Old chisel marks remained, traces of an unfinished past. The stone was flawed. It resisted the artist from the very beginning. Those around him watched closely. They waited for his reaction. Some believed he would refuse, as others had done. Others wondered whether the man who had created the Pietà would dare to take on something so close to impossible. But Michelangelo did not see the stone as they did. He did not look at its flaws in the same way. The damaged lines, the failed cuts, and the weakened sections did not make him step back. He looked into those limits and began to measure how far he could go within them. And within those limits, he began to imagine. Michelangelo believed that within every block of stone, a form already existed. His task was not to create it, but to release it. But in this block, that form was not easily seen. It was distorted, restricted, almost trapped. And that was precisely why Michelangelo chose to accept the work. To him, a perfect block of marble held little interest. A stone that resisted him, that was the true challenge. Word of his decision spread quickly through the city. Some supported him, others doubted. Florence had seen many talented artists fail under the weight of great commissions, and this time the risk was even greater. The material itself was already flawed. Michelangelo began work in 1501. The block was set up in a workspace belonging to the cathedral. It was not fully enclosed, yet not entirely open to the street. Unlike many works hidden away in private studios, this space allowed passers-by to pause and watch him as he worked. That changed everything. Each strike of the chisel was not just part of the process. It was a statement. A small mistake could be seen. A wrong decision might never be undone. Michelangelo worked almost entirely alone. He began with the most difficult sections, where the stone narrowed and left little room for correction. Large fragments broke away and fell to the ground with a heavy, hollow sound. Dust rose into the air, settling over the floor and everything around it. There was a dry, cold scent to the carved stone, clinging to the throat, making each breath feel heavier. Those who came to watch rarely stayed long, but Michelangelo remained for hours. Slowly, a form began to emerge. Not a king, not a saint, a young man. Michelangelo had chosen to carve David, the biblical figure who would defeat Goliath. But instead of capturing the moment of victory, he chose something else. The moment before. David stood upright, his body held in quiet tension, his gaze focused. There was no enemy in sight. No action yet unfolding, only preparation. It was an unusual choice. In the art of that time, David was often shown after triumph, with Goliath's head at his feet. But Michelangelo was drawn to the moment before certainty, the moment when nothing is resolved. The moment when a young man stands before something greater than himself. And as Michelangelo worked, that image slowly became clear. The muscles were carved with a restrained tension, not an explosive force, but strength held in reserve. The hands were larger than natural, as if hinting at an action yet to come. The gaze stretched into the distance, fixed on something the viewer could not see. Passers-by began to linger longer. No longer just curious, they started to understand. The ruined block was becoming something else. And yet, the work was not finished. The further Michelangelo went, the greater the risk became. A single mistake at this stage could destroy everything. There was no way back, no layer to correct. Only stone and decisions that could not be undone. Michelangelo knew this each time he paused before the block, chisel in hand, waiting. He worked more slowly now, more carefully. There were days when he stood still for long stretches before making the next cut. Not out of hesitation, but because he was trying to see what the stone would allow. Not every idea could be realized. And over time, he began to feel that this block carried a voice of its own. Florence started to pay closer attention, not because of Michelangelo himself, but because of what was taking shape before their eyes. A new image, unlike anything they had seen before. A David, not as a symbol of victory, but as a symbol of confrontation. In a city that had endured such upheaval, that image carried a quiet weight. But at that moment, the sculpture was still unfinished. It stood there, between dust and light, and between strokes not yet completed, and Michelangelo remained with it day after day, continuing his work on a block many had once believed unusable. No one knew for certain what it would become, but it was becoming harder to believe it would fail. And as the final form began to reveal itself more clearly, another question emerged. Not who would carve it, but where Florence would place it. Chapter 9. Michelangelo's David, the sculpture that became a symbol of freedom in Florence. One morning in Florence, a small crowd gathered around a newly finished statue. There was no more marble dust, no more sound of the chisel, only a figure standing there, tall and still, as if it had always belonged to that place. Light moved across the surface of the stone, tracing the lines of muscle, then settling on the face, where David's eyes did not meet theirs, but looked outward toward something not yet seen. Michelangelo stood at a distance. He did not step forward right away. He looked at the statue as if it were unfamiliar, as though testing whether the image he had carried in his mind had truly taken form before him. It was one of the rare moments when he could see the work in its entirety, in silence, when every fragment had come together, and nothing more could be added or changed. A few people began to walk around it. They did not speak much, not because there was nothing to say, but because they did not yet know how to speak about what stood before them. Some paused at the face. Others looked down at the hands. Some moved behind it, trying to follow the direction of David's gaze, as if, from the right angle, they might see what he was facing. Michelangelo watched them quietly. He could not hear every word, but he understood something clearly. They were no longer seeing stone. They were seeing a man. And in that moment, the sculpture began to leave him. The news spread quickly, but Florence did not react as Rome had. There was no immediate praise. People returned, looked again, then spoke among themselves. In workshops, in markets, and even in the halls of government, David was discussed. But each person seemed to see something different. No one fully agreed. And so the question of where to place the statue became important. At first, it had been intended for the cathedral roof, where it would stand as a religious image overlooking the city. But once David stood before them, that plan began to falter. The statue was too large, too detailed, too alive to be placed so far from view. A council was called. Influential figures of the city gathered around the statue. They looked up at it, then at one another, and began to debate. The question was no longer technical. It was about meaning. If placed within the church, David would belong to religion. If placed in the public square, he would belong to the city. Michelangelo was present, but not at the center. He stood near his work, listening as others spoke of it as a symbol, a message, an image of Florence itself. Few spoke of it as a work of art, and no one asked what he thought. Michelangelo did not object. He was not a man who argued in public. But as he listened, he began to understand something. David was no longer his, and that did not happen later. It was happening in that very moment, in the voices of others trying to define it. To Michelangelo, David was a moment, a young man standing before something greater than himself. There was no square, no crowd, no grand meaning attached to it. Only a brief stillness, just before everything begins. But in the voices of others, that stillness was already fading. At last, a decision was made. David would be placed in the Piazza della Signoria, before the seat of Florence's government, and where the authority of the city stood most visibly. Michelangelo said nothing when he heard the decision, but he understood what it meant. The sculpture would no longer be only art. It would become a statement. The moving of the statue began soon after. A wooden structure was built around David to protect him, and the process unfolded slowly, with great care. A single mistake could undo everything. In those days, the streets of Florence felt different. People gathered along the roads, watching as the statue passed, as if something within the city itself was shifting. Michelangelo walked with the procession for a short distance. He did not speak. He simply looked at his work from the outside for the first time, as others did. From that angle, he could not see the whole, only fragments through the gaps in the wooden frame, as if the sculpture no longer fully belonged to him. When David was finally placed in its position, everything became clear. The statue no longer belonged to Michelangelo. It belonged to Florence. David's gaze extended beyond the city, toward dangers people believed were out there. And now, a small republic had an image to stand beside. The statue did not need to move. It only needed to stand. In the years that followed, people passed it every day. Meetings took place beneath its presence. Decisions were made under the shadow of a young figure in stone, poised before an unseen battle. By then, Michelangelo had become a name known across the city. But what he carried away from David was not fame. It was something quieter. That once a work leaves the hands of its maker, it begins a life the maker can no longer control. A quiet kind of loss. Michelangelo never spoke of it, but he carried it with him. And somewhere else, there were those searching not just for a skilled artist, but for someone who could turn ambition into form. One of them was in Rome, not in a church, not in a workshop, but at the center of power. And he was looking for Michelangelo. Chapter 10. Michelangelo and Pope Julius II. The conflict between artistic genius and the power of the Vatican. One afternoon in Rome, a man walked into the Vatican carrying a set of drawings. In the wide, cold corridors, the sound of his footsteps echoed softly against the stone. He was not a nobleman nor a cleric. He was an artist. And this time, he did not arrive as an unknown, but with the weight of Pietà and David behind him. The man who had summoned him was Julius II. He was not the kind of pope people imagined. He rode into battle, led armies, and waged wars to expand the power of the Vatican. But his ambition reached beyond war. He wanted to transform Rome into the greatest center of the Christian world. Julius II wanted a tomb. Not an ordinary one, but a vast monument filled with dozens of marble figures. And it had to be large enough to silence anyone who entered its presence. For Michelangelo, it was a dream. It held everything he desired. Stone, the human form, scale. He began at once. Michelangelo left Rome for Carrara, where the great quarries lay. There, he walked among towering blocks of marble, placing his hands upon them, studying their veins, searching for those he believed held a figure within. The work took months. When he returned to Rome, he brought with him carefully chosen blocks. In his mind, the tomb of Julius II had already begun to take shape. Figures, postures, bodies filled with restrained energy. But Rome had changed. Julius II was no longer focused on the tomb. His attention had shifted elsewhere. War, politics, larger projects. Michelangelo did not see it at first. He waited. Then he asked. And slowly, he began to understand. His work was being set aside. To Michelangelo, it was not simply a delay. It was an insult. He had given his time and belief to the project, and now it was left behind, as if it no longer mattered. His anger grew. He went to the Vatican to seek an audience with Julius, but he was not always admitted. Those around the Pope controlled access, and an artist, no matter how gifted, still had to wait. One day, after repeated delays, Michelangelo made a decision. He left Rome. No announcement, no permission. He returned to Florence, carrying his anger with him. But leaving a pope was never simple. Julius II did not let it pass. He sent letters. Michelangelo did not reply. He sent more. Still no answer. At last, he dispatched envoys to Florence with a clear message. Michelangelo must return. For a time, Michelangelo tried to avoid it, but he understood the truth. The power of Julius extended far beyond art, and to confront it directly was not a real choice. Michelangelo returned to Rome. The meeting between the two men was not easy. Julius was impatient. Michelangelo was not one to yield. Their exchange felt less like an agreement, more like a collision. And yet, in the end, Michelangelo had to work, not on the tomb, on something else. Julius II wanted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel repainted. And over time, that idea grew larger, more ambitious, until it became something far beyond a simple commission. For Michelangelo, it was a problem. He was not a painter. He was a sculptor. Fresco on a ceiling was an entirely different craft, one that demanded techniques and experience he did not believe he possessed. He tried to refuse, but this time he could not leave. Julius did not ask. He commanded. Michelangelo stood before a choice that was not truly a choice. Either he accepted, or he faced the full weight of the most powerful authority in Rome. And so he began to do what he did not want to do. He began to paint, not on walls, but across a ceiling. Not a single image, but a vast expanse he would have to turn into a world. In the beginning, he believed the work might end quickly. But he soon understood that he had stepped into something far greater. A task that would take years, that would change his body, and perhaps even the way he understood art itself. Michelangelo built scaffolding inside the Sistine Chapel. He climbed high above the floor, looked out across the empty ceiling, and began with his first strokes. There was no stone now, no sound of the chisel, but only plaster, color, and a flat surface he had to transform into a sky. And this time, he would have to create everything from nothing. Alone. Chapter 11. Michelangelo. Painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. A 4-year struggle with paint, plaster, and the body. In the early days, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel still carried its simple, older decorations. But to Michelangelo, it was almost a surface that had to be remade from the beginning. There were no angels yet, no prophets. None of the monumental figures would later be remembered. Only fresh plaster, still damp, and the first outlines, drawn by a hand not yet certain of itself. He did not begin with confidence. He began with hesitation. Fresco was not like stone, With stone, he could return, correct, and continue. But with wet plaster, time did not wait. Once it dried, everything was fixed. And if something was wrong, it had to be destroyed and done again. Michelangelo was not used to that. In those early days, he worked like someone learning all over again. He tried. He failed. At one point, an entire section had to be scraped away. The plaster had gone wrong. The colors would not hold as he intended. Small things, perhaps, but enough to slow everything, enough to show him that this was not work that could be carried by instinct alone. At first, he did not work alone. There were assistants, trained in fresco. But the more he worked, the less satisfied he became. What they painted did not match what he saw. And in the end, he let most of them go. Not because they lacked skill, but because he could not share his vision. From that moment, the work grew slower and clearer. Michelangelo began to move in small sections, completing only what he could before the plaster dried. He no longer thought of the entire ceiling, only the part before him. Gradually, the images began to emerge. At first, the figures were smaller, simpler, but over time, they grew larger, more complex. Bodies began to twist through space, no longer still as in traditional painting. Michelangelo did not paint like a painter. He painted like a sculptor. Each figure carried weight. Muscles felt as though they existed beneath the surface of color. The lines were not soft, but firm, almost tangible. He was not trying to make the painting beautiful. He was trying to make it real. And as the work progressed, another problem appeared. The ceiling was too vast. What looked right up close lost its power when seen from the floor below. Michelangelo had to change his approach. The figures grew larger, clearer. He began to think of the ceiling as a space designed to be seen from a distance. Time passed. The first sections were completed. When part of the scaffolding was taken down, people saw his work for the first time. The reaction was not loud amazement. It was silence, because what they saw did not resemble anything they knew. Julius II came to see the work. He was not easily impressed, but even he could sense that this project was becoming something far greater than it had first been imagined. He wanted it done faster. Michelangelo could not move faster without losing what mattered. And between them, tension began to grow. There were days when Michelangelo worked without pause, and there were days when he stopped, studying a single detail. An arm not quite right, a face that did not yet hold its truth. He would stand there, then return to it, adjusting, refining. The work moved slowly, but it never stopped. As the years passed, his body began to change. Fatigue settled into him. His vision suffered. In letters, he wrote of discomfort, of the strain, of how his body had to bend itself to this work. Still, he did not stop. At some point, it was no longer a command. It became something he had to finish. When the final sections were painted, the ceiling was no longer a collection of separate images. It had become a continuous story, unfolding from creation to fall, from the first human to the voices of prophecy. It was not meant to be read. It was meant to be seen. When the last of the scaffolding came down, the entire ceiling revealed itself. There was no grand announcement, only a space people entered, where they lifted their eyes and found they could not look away. Michelangelo was not standing at the center of that room. He had already stepped down. For others, it was a masterpiece. For him, it was a finished task. What he carried with him was not fame. It was the understanding that he could do more than he had once believed, and endure more than he had ever imagined. But the work was not truly over. Not with Julius II. Not with Rome. And not with Michelangelo himself. Chapter 12. Fame and Solitude. When Michelangelo became the greatest artist in Europe, when the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was completed, Michelangelo was no longer an ordinary artist. His name began to be spoken not only in Rome, but across the great cities of Italy. Those who had never known him now spoke of him as a new standard, and young artists came to the Vatican, lifting their eyes to the ceiling, trying to understand how such monumental bodies had been brought into being. Fame arrived quickly, and with it, expectation. But for Michelangelo, nothing changed in the way people imagined. He did not become more open. He did not appear more often. He did not take pleasure in his new position. He continued to live much as he had before, working alone, avoiding unnecessary conversation, keeping a quiet distance from those around him. Fame did not lighten his life. It made it heavier. In 1513, Julius II died. For Michelangelo, it was not a simple moment. Their relationship had never been easy, but Julius had been the one who brought him into the greatest works of his life. After Julius's death, the tomb project returned, but it was no longer the same. Under new popes, the scale was reduced. The plans were altered. Michelangelo was forced to adapt again and again. He was not dissatisfied because the work had become smaller, but because it was no longer what he had once imagined. In the years that followed, he devoted much of his time to that tomb. The work stretched on, interrupted, resumed, reshaped. There was no clear direction, no certain end. And slowly, it became something that would never truly be completed in the way he had intended. During this time, Michelangelo's life grew more austere. He slept little, ate simply, worked almost without rest. Those who met him often remarked that he looked more like a laborer than a celebrated artist. His clothes rarely changed, his appearance of little concern to him. Though his name had spread across cities, his way of living remained largely the same, partly from habit, and partly because he sent money back to his family in Florence, an obligation that kept his life deliberately modest. But the deeper change was not in how he lived. It was in how he saw others. Michelangelo grew more guarded. He rarely gave his full trust to anyone. He argued with patrons, distrusted collaborators, kept his distance even from friends. And even in close relationships, he never fully opened himself. Fame made him visible, but it also made him alone. And while this was happening, the world of art around him was shifting. A younger artist, Raphael, was rising in Rome, admired for a style that was softer, more graceful, more easily embraced. While Michelangelo worked in tension and solitude, Raphael worked within a circle of people, surrounded by students and support. The two paths were not the same, and Michelangelo saw it clearly. He did not try to become Raphael, but he could not ignore the difference. In a city where art was tied to power and taste, being admired could matter as much as being great. Michelangelo did not belong to that world. He did not create to please. He worked toward something he himself could not fully explain. The years passed, and the work continued. The tomb of Julius II changed again and again. Sculptures were completed, then set aside. Ideas were drawn, and then never realized. Through all of it, Michelangelo kept working. But the sense of urgency he once felt began to fade. Something had shifted, not in his technique, but in something quieter. Fame had given him the highest place in art, but not peace. Instead, it made him more aware of his own limits and of the distance between what he wanted to create and what the world allowed him to do. And then, something happened. Not in a workshop, not inside a church, but outside where art was no longer the center. In 1527, Rome was attacked. In that moment, sculptures, paintings, and even years of labor seemed to lose their place at the center of things. Something larger was moving. Once again, history entered his life. And this time, he could not remain apart. Chapter 13. War and the Fall of the Renaissance, when Michelangelo became a military engineer. One morning, news reached Florence. Rome had been attacked. At first, no one knew exactly what had happened. Only fragments of stories. Soldiers flooding into the city, churches looted, people fleeing, smoke rising from entire quarters. For days, Rome was no longer the center of the Christian world. It became a place of chaos, where no clear order remained. In Florence, Michelangelo heard the news. He had lived in Rome for years. He knew those streets, those churches. And now, they were being broken apart. The news did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, through travelers, merchants, letters. Each carried a different piece of the story, but all pointed to the same truth. Rome was no longer safe. Familiar names disappeared from the accounts. No one knew who was still alive. And Florence began to change. Conversations grew shorter. The squares were no longer as full. The city walls were inspected again. Gates were reinforced. Florence prepared for the possibility of an attack. Michelangelo did not leave. He stayed. And for the first time in his life, he was not working with stone or paint. He turned to the defense of the city. He walked along the walls, studied the gates, examined weak points. His drawings no longer traced the human body, but fortifications and angles of defense. He had not been trained as a military engineer, but he understood form. He understood structure, and he applied that knowledge here. He spent long hours outdoors, under the sun, along high walls, surrounded by voices and the sound of construction. This was not work done in solitude, and it demanded quick observation, quick decisions, and the acceptance that there was no time to make everything perfect. Florence was no longer a city of art. It was a city waiting for war. Michelangelo was given responsibility over part of the city's defenses. It was an important role, and a new kind of pressure. Those who had known him as an artist now looked at him differently. Not everyone understood why a sculptor had been given such a task. But in that moment, titles mattered less than what one could do. In 1529, Florence was under siege. The gates were closed. Food began to grow scarce. People moved less. The air in the city tightened, growing quiet. Markets shrank. Prices rose. Families stored what little they could. In the streets, voices softened. Steps quickened. No one knew how long the siege would last. Michelangelo kept working. He walked along the walls each day, inspecting, repairing, adjusting. But as time went on, the work no longer brought a sense of certainty. What he was doing could delay what was coming. It could not stop it. There were days when everything felt the same. Walking, checking, returning, then walking again. There was no clear moment to say things were improving, only the feeling that everything was continuing and had not yet collapsed. For a brief time, Michelangelo left Florence. No one knows exactly what he was thinking then. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps exhaustion, but he returned, not because he believed the city would win, but because he could not leave while it was still unfolding. The siege dragged on, and in the end, Florence fell. The Medici returned to power. For Michelangelo, this was not only politics, and he had taken part in the defense of the city. He had stood on the opposing side. Those who had worked with him during the defense scattered. Some disappeared. Some fell silent. The city changed quickly, but not loudly. The shift lived in the way people looked at one another, in what was no longer spoken. For a time, Michelangelo lived more quietly. He avoided crowds, took on little work, stayed out of sight. He remained in the city, but did not wish to be seen. His life narrowed. No great commissions, no gatherings, only slow days and a quiet sense of waiting without knowing for what. And yet, what he feared did not come. There was no punishment. Instead, there was a call. The Medici still needed him. Once again, work drew him back toward the path he had known. Michelangelo was asked to return to work, but not in Florence, in Rome, and this departure was not like the others. It was no longer a journey in search of opportunity, but a leaving after everything had changed. The city he turned away from was no longer the one in which he had grown up. In Rome, Clement VII was waiting, and this time, the work would be different. No longer building, no longer defending, but an image of something all must face: death and judgment. Chapter 14. The Last Judgment, the most controversial masterpiece in the history of the Vatican Rome. In the early 1530s, was no longer the city Michelangelo had once known. After the sack of 1527, many parts had yet to fully recover. Some churches were restored, but the atmosphere had changed. Less display, more caution, a quiet weight in the air. When Michelangelo returned, he did not come as a young artist seeking opportunity. He came as a name already known. But the work waiting for him was not a sculpture, not a building. It was a wall. The wall behind the altar in the Sistine Chapel. Pope Clement VII first commissioned the work. After his death, the project continued under Pope Paul III. The request was clear: a great fresco of the Last Judgment. It was not a new subject, but Michelangelo would not approach it in the old way. He began by removing almost everything that had once covered the wall. The earlier paintings were destroyed to make room for something entirely new. A space without clear divisions, no simple separation between above and below, between salvation and damnation. It was not a simple decision. It meant replacing what had stood before in a sacred place. But Michelangelo did not want to revise. He wanted to begin again. The work began in 1536. By then, Michelangelo was over 60. Yet he worked as he always had, alone, in control of every detail, unwilling to depend on others. The days passed in familiar silence, with scaffolding, wet plaster, and long stretches of stillness before the wall. This time, unlike the ceiling, he did not tell a story in separate scenes. He created movement. At the center stood Christ, not the gentle figure people expected, but a powerful presence in motion. Around him, hundreds of bodies turned, fell, rose, were pulled upward, or cast down. The entire wall became a current. Michelangelo no longer concerned himself with making the image easy to follow. He was concerned with what it felt like. The viewer did not read the painting. They were drawn into it. There were no clear boundaries, only motion, only states of being. For months, then years, he worked on that wall. Painting, revising, painting again. Forms changed constantly. Some sections were scraped away and begun again, not because they were technically wrong, but because they did not yet hold the feeling he was searching for. As the image slowly revealed itself, reactions began to rise. Some were struck by its force, but not all accepted it, and the near-naked bodies unsettled many. Some said it did not belong in a sacred space. Others called it too violent, too lacking in restraint. The criticism spread. Michelangelo did not answer. He continued to work, as if those voices could not alter what he was trying to bring into form. In one corner of the painting, there is a figure holding a flayed skin. The surface of it is rendered with unsettling precision. Many later believed the face on that skin is Michelangelo's own. There is no certainty, but if it is true, it is not a casual image, not glory, something exposed, stripped of all concealment. By 1541, the work was complete. Those who first saw it stood in silence, but this silence was not the same as before, not the quiet wonder of the ceiling. This was heavier. The painting did not comfort, and it offered no safe place for the viewer to stand. In a space that once expressed order, Michelangelo had created something uncertain, and that is what made it different. The controversy did not end. In time, parts of the painting were altered. Drapery was added to cover the bodies, to bring it closer to what the church required. Michelangelo no longer had control over that. As with his earlier works, once it was finished, it began a life of its own. But this time, there was something else. The painting was not only a work, it was a question. And when Michelangelo stepped away from that wall, he did not leave as a man who had simply completed a task. He left as someone who had faced something he could not avoid. From that moment on, his work began to change. It no longer reached outward. It turned inward, toward the soul, toward questions that could not be answered with stone or with paint. Chapter 15. Michelangelo and the Dome of St. Peter's. When an aging genius begins to question his own art. When Michelangelo was placed in charge of St. Peter's Basilica, he was already over 70. At that age, many had long stepped away from work or taken only small commissions. But for Michelangelo, this became one of the greatest undertakings of his life. St. Peter's was not a new project. It had begun years before, passing through the hands of different architects, each leaving behind drawings, ideas, fragments of a structure not yet complete. When Michelangelo arrived, he entered something unfinished. The existing plans did not fully agree with one another. Parts had been built that no longer fit the whole. Decisions had been made that no longer held. Michelangelo looked at all of it and chose to change it. He simplified the design, removed what was unnecessary, focused on form that was clear, solid, and enduring. To him, a structure like St. Peter's should not be complicated. It should carry weight, like a massive block of stone placed at the center of a city. The dome became the heart of the entire structure. Michelangelo was not the first to imagine a dome for St. Peter's, but the way he saw it was different. It was not simply a covering, but the element that defined the entire space. He spent long hours on its design, not to make it more complex, but to make it clearer. For Michelangelo, clarity came from removing what did not belong. The work moved slowly, not from lack of ability, but from the scale of it. St. Peter's was a project that stretched across generations. Michelangelo understood this. He also understood something else, and he would not live to see it finished. That knowledge changed the nature of the work. With a sculpture or a painting, he could reach an ending. But with St. Peter's, the end lay beyond his own time. Still, he worked each day. Those around him saw him move through the site, observing, adjusting, giving direction. He no longer shaped everything with his hands, but he guided the work with his eye and experience. He refused payment. To him, this was not simply architecture. It was a responsibility to God. Beyond the construction site, his life grew even more narrow. Michelangelo lived simply, almost austerely. He slept little, ate little. He cared little for comfort. His room held almost nothing. There was no sign of a man considered the greatest artist in Europe. Though he had money, he did not spend it on himself. Most of it was sent back to his family in Florence. His letters show how deeply he felt that obligation. He had no family of his own, no wife, no children. His closest relationships lived in letters. Among them was Vittoria Colonna, a noblewoman he trusted. They wrote to one another about faith, about the soul, about the meaning of life. In those letters, another Michelangelo appears, not the hardened artist, but a man searching for answers to things that lay beyond art. During these years, Michelangelo began to write more. He wrote poetry, not for publication, but as a way of holding his thoughts in place. They spoke little of art. Instead, they turned toward the soul, toward sin, toward the question of salvation. He began to doubt the very thing he had pursued his entire life. Was art enough to bring a person closer to God, or was it only another form of pride? This change did not come suddenly. It arrived slowly after everything he had done, after the Sistine ceiling, after the Last Judgment. Michelangelo began to look back on his life from a distance. He did not reject art, but he no longer believed in it as he once had. There were moments when he looked at his own work and did not see the perfection others admired. He saw only what had not yet been reached. Meanwhile, the work on St. Peter's continued. The dome slowly rose according to his design. Its great curves began to shape the skyline of Rome. Even unfinished, it had already become part of the city. But Michelangelo did not see it as a symbol. He saw it as something incomplete, something he knew he would never finish. The final years came quietly, but with certainty. He continued to work, though the rhythm had changed. Fewer grand projects, less outward ambition, more inward thought. In a quiet room, he returned to what he had always trusted most: stone. But now, his way of working had changed. There was no longer a pursuit of perfection. No polished surfaces brought to completion. Figures began to emerge from the marble, but not fully. They seemed caught between states, between forming and dissolving. These were no longer sculptures for the public. They were for him. And among them was one that would become his final work. A piece left unfinished. But perhaps, for the first time, it did not need to be. Chapter 16. The Rondanini Pietà. The final stone as Michelangelo prepares to face death. In the final years of his life, Michelangelo no longer worked on great projects as he once had. There were no vast commissions stretching across years, no demands from popes, no designs for entire cities. His world grew smaller, slower, quieter. But he did not stop working. In a simple room in Rome, Michelangelo returned to stone, not the monumental blocks meant for churches or public squares, but a single piece he kept close, shaping it without a fixed plan, without a finished drawing to guide him. It was a Pietà. The subject was not new to him. Years before, he had created the Pietà in St. Peter's, a work of near-perfect finish, polished until light moved across it like living skin. But the sculpture before him now was different, and the stone remained rough. Figures began to emerge, but did not fully separate from it. The Virgin and Christ were no longer distinct bodies as before. They stretched into one another, merging as if dissolving into a single form. Michelangelo no longer sought perfection in the surface. He did not smooth the marble. The marks of the chisel remained, and he did not try to erase them. The work moved slowly. There were no longer long, unbroken days as in his youth. He was old now. His body no longer obeyed him as it once had. And yet he returned to that stone day after day. No one required him to finish it. There was no deadline, no patron waiting. This was work only for himself. At times, he changed the form entirely. Not small corrections, but shifts in direction. Parts already carved were broken away. Yet what had once seemed finished was no longer kept. Such things had rarely happened in his earlier work. But now, he was no longer bound by expectation or reputation. He worked as if searching for something, not within the stone, but within himself. Those around him noticed the change. Michelangelo appeared less often. He spoke less. The arguments and tensions of earlier years faded. He became quieter. His days passed simply. A little work, a pause, then a return to the stone. There was no urgency, no sense of needing to complete something before time ran out. And yet, time continued to move. Michelangelo knew this. He had lived through generations. He had seen Florence change, Rome change, art itself change. But now, for the first time, he faced something that would not change. Death. In the poems of his final years, he wrote more of the soul. He no longer spoke of form or the beauty of the body, but of salvation, of faith, of the limits of being human. He began to see art differently, no longer as a path toward perfection, but as something that could not answer the deepest questions. That realization did not make him stop, but it changed how he worked. The Rondanini Pietà continued to evolve. The figures grew thinner, more elongated. They no longer carried the weight and solidity of his earlier sculptures. They seemed lighter, as if no longer bound to the stone, There was a sense that Michelangelo was no longer trying to release the figure from the marble as he had believed in his youth. Instead, he allowed it to remain within the stone, as if accepting that not everything could be completed. It was a profound shift. All his life, he had believed the figure already existed within the block, waiting to be freed. But now, at the end, he no longer seemed certain. The sculpture did not move toward perfection. It moved toward something else, a state unfinished. Not because time had run out, but because it did not need to be finished. Michelangelo continued to work on it almost until his final days. Even as his strength faded, he returned to the stone, not to complete it, but to continue. There are accounts that he still held the chisel in his last days, though his body had grown weak. Not because he believed he would finish the sculpture, but because he was not ready to stop. In 1564, Michelangelo died in Rome at the age of 88. The Rondanini Pietà remained unfinished, unpolished, incomplete. But it was not a failure. It was the trace of a lifelong process, from a boy who believed that every block of stone held a human form within it, to an old man who was no longer certain those forms could ever be fully released. And perhaps, for the first time, Michelangelo accepted that, not in words, but in the way he left his final stone unfinished. And in that silence, the deepest question of his life remained, not within the works he had completed, but within what he left unresolved. Chapter 17. The Legacy of Michelangelo. A genius who changed art forever, yet never found peace. After Michelangelo died in 1564, his body did not remain in Rome for long. Friends and family carried him back to Florence, the city where he had grown up, where everything had begun. He was laid to rest in Santa Croce, among those who would later become symbols of Italy itself. But his death did not close his story. In the years that followed, young artists continued to travel to Rome and Florence. They stood before his works, trying to understand what he had done. They looked up at the Sistine ceiling. They walked around the David. They stood before the Pietà in silence, just as the first viewers once had. No one saw these works as stone or paint anymore. They saw a standard. Michelangelo changed the way people saw the human body. Before him, the body could be beautiful. It could be precise. After him, it became something else. A place of strength, of attention, of emotion. His figures do not stand still. They turn. They twist. They carry an energy that can be felt, even by those who do not understand art. That influence spread. Artists who came after him studied his work, but they could not become him. Some tried to imitate the power of his forms. Others tried to recreate the way he shaped the body. But the more they tried, the clearer it became. What made Michelangelo was not only technique, it was the way he saw the world. For him, art was not decoration. It was not made to please. It was a confrontation between human and material, between idea and limitation, between what he saw in his mind and what his hands could bring into being. And that confrontation was never easy. Throughout his life, Michelangelo worked in tension. He argued with popes. He grew dissatisfied with patrons. He never fully trusted those around him. Even at the height of his fame, he lived like a man still trying to prove something. Not to others, but to himself. He never married. He had no family in the usual sense. His relationships were often complex, sometimes distant, sometimes filled with emotion, yet difficult to grasp. His poetry reveals a man far more sensitive than his austere appearance suggested. But even in those private moments, Michelangelo never found complete peace. He kept working, even when he no longer needed to, even when no one asked him to. Perhaps that is what defines him most clearly. Not his works, not his fame, but the refusal to stop. A sense that something remained unfinished, unresolved, unreleased. And perhaps that feeling never truly left him. His final works were not perfect in the traditional sense. They were not smooth, not balanced, not finished in the way his earlier works had been. And yet, within that incompleteness, something else begins to appear. A kind of acceptance. Not everything can be freed from stone. Not every idea can take form. Not every question has an answer. Michelangelo spent his life searching for the human figure within marble. He believed it was already there, waiting, and that his task was only to remove what did not belong. He did this better than anyone. But at the end of his life, standing before his final block of stone, perhaps he saw something different. Not a figure waiting to be released, but a limit he could not cross. And for the first time, he did not try to overcome it. He left it there, unfinished, not as failure, but as part of the story. Today, millions still stand beneath the Sistine ceiling, looking up at two hands reaching toward each other. The small space between them remains. It has never been filled. Perhaps because it does not need to be. Perhaps that space is what matters most. Michelangelo freed figures from stone, but perhaps he never freed himself. And that is what makes him human, not only a genius. And perhaps his story does not truly end here. Because each time someone stands before a block of stone or lifts a hand to draw the human body, the same question returns. Not how to create, but what is already there. That is no longer only the question of an artist. It is the question of anyone trying to understand themselves. If you have followed this story to this point, perhaps you have seen it in your own way. And if you wish to continue exploring stories like this, of those who changed the way we see the world, you may stay, follow, or return whenever you need. Because there are still many stories waiting, quietly, to be told.